Hello everyone, Rich Hagan here at the news desk here at Pro Tour Magic Origins with Randy Buehler. Randy, we're going to go inside Standard with you over the next 20 minutes or so as the players get rid of their 40-card decks, go back to the 60-75 of Standard. We've already had 5 rounds yesterday. We had 391 lists to look at. So give us a sense of the shape of Standard.
Sure. I mean, the day one metagame breakdown was pretty interesting. Nothing went over about 15% of the field. So it was a fairly open Standard, and a real thing that happens on day two, the thing that happens now is we find out who can actually beat that prepared metagame, right? Who actually prepared for the right metagame. So you look at the day one metagame breakdown, Devotion was the most played deck. Red Aggro came in second, Abzan Control, Blue, Red, and Soul Artifacts surprised a lot of people. So we've seen this. This is the metagame breakdown that we've had on day one, but now things start to shift. And now you start to see, those Green Red Devotion players, were they prepared for a field of all red aggro? We learned a lot yesterday about what impact Magic Origins was going to have on this Pro Tour as well. So that's the thing I really want to focus on today is how much has changed? Because you know what this isn't? This isn't a bunch of Siege Rhinos on top. Like you see Abzan Control, you see Abzan Aggro at the bottom of the list. This is not last month's Standard by any stretch of the imagination. Magic Origins has come in and shaken things up dramatically.
Yeah, interestingly, it's maybe not even last week's Standard.
Yes, for sure.
So why don't we take a look then at some of the key Magic Origins cards that did make an impact yesterday, that we think are going to make an impact today, and indeed tomorrow in the top 8. Why don't we start off, let's go Planeswalker, let's go with Jace Vryn's Prodigy.
The story for Magic Origins begins with the Planeswalkers. All 5 of them are interesting constructed cards. All 5 of them, in my opinion, are actually a triumph of the marriage of mechanics and flavor as well. They're little mini stories. I mean, you've been watching the inside R&D pieces. I think this is just a home run from an R&D point of view. Not only are they flavorful, not only are they cool, they're also all at these really interesting power levels. I do think Jace Vryn's Prodigy is the best of them, and a lot of people expected a lot of blue decks, especially it's a Pro Tour, right? How can the pro teams resist a Jace? A few more of them resisted than maybe people were expecting, but Jace is still great card, fuels multiple decks, and he's going to be a fixture in Standard for the next 18 months or so.
Yeah, when a lot of the pro teams ended up with red, they were going, well, turns out Control really struggles to deal with this. And so although it's been given Jace, maybe it hasn't been given quite enough to compete with the lightning speed of red.
I actually talked to Brad Nelson. He and his team wound up on a Green Devotion list. In particular, they thought they had their deck metagames to beat Jace specifically. They expected all the other big teams were going to show up with Jace decks, and that they thought they had a really good metagame position to beat Jace. Now, if you follow Brad Nelson on Twitter, you saw last night he admitted it's the worst job of metagaming he's ever done at the Pro Tour. It is not a field full of Jace. I mean, he's around and he's important, but it's a field full of red. So we'll get to that.
So that's one Planeswalker. We're not going through all 5 because they aren't all created equal. We will, though, show you this, Liliana, Heretical Healer. Liliana
showed up the second most, and in particular, she shows up in the Rally of the Ancestors decks. You talk about this not even being last week's Standard. Last week, the fact that Rally of the Ancestors won that big Star City Open event had a huge impact on this tournament. It had an impact on anybody who might have played Rally, who were like, no, the cat's out of the bag, what are we going to do now? If it had finished 7th or 12th, I think it would have had a very good weekend. As it is, it's here. Liliana is one of the new additions that really fuels that deck. Nantuko Husk is the other card, probably the even more important card, but Liliana, very good Planeswalker, does a lot of cool stuff. Nissa's also shown up in decent numbers. Seen a couple of Chandras. I haven't seen much Kithian in the feature match area, but all these Planeswalkers are awesome.
Yeah,
so.
it's almost reminiscent of the 5 Theros gods. In that we didn't see the white one, at least initially in Standard. So maybe Kithian and Gideon will have his time, as it were. All right, now, we said already there's a lot of red around. Yeah. And one of the reasons for that, and one of the reasons that Control doesn't like it, here's a great card, Exquisite Firecraft.
4 damage for just 3 mana, and that spell mastery is very important. If you thought everybody was going to show up with Jace decks, the fact that your 4 damage spell is uncounterable is huge. So Exquisite Firecraft has definitely big new tool added. I mean, think about it. Mono Red won the last Pro Tour. Well, it wasn't Mono Red, but Red Aggro won the last Pro Tour. Martin Dang with the Atarka Red deck. And the Red deck probably got the most cool new toys out of Origins. So here you go. Exquisite Firecraft is one of those new weapons. Spell Mastery is a real thorn in the side of the blue decks, and it's one of the reasons you're seeing so much red here.
Is Exquisite Firecraft something that is very difficult to miss? Because I read that card and I understand it's very good. If I compare that to a card like, well, let's say Jace, I know it's going to be a Planeswalker, but I'm evaluating it in a whole new world because it's a new class of card, essentially. And then if you go to a card like, let's say, Whirler Rogue, well, trying to see Whirler Rogue as a big deal in Constructed, that's real crystal ball time. But Exquisite Firecraft, you go, yeah, I read the words, I understand them, it is really good. So how did people miss red?
Well, everybody knows Exquisite Firecraft is good. The question is, how well set up is the metagame for the red decks? So it isn't so much, of course, you're going to test Exquisite Firecraft in your red decks. The question is, what's your gauntlet? If you test a bunch of Courser of Krufix decks, red doesn't really like to see Courser of Krufix. It's a 2/4, it gains life. But if the Green Devotion players I hate to keep harping on Brad Nelson, but one of the things he felt the worst about from a metagame point of view, they took their Coursers out of their Devotion deck. They didn't love the Coursers in the blue matchup, which is what they thought they were going to run into. So yeah, Brad's self-proclaimed worst job he's done metagaming for a Pro Tour. They don't even have Coursers.
We should stay with red.
So now that, yeah.
Let's keep with red, because up next, it's Abbot of Karal Keep.
Yeah, and this card is very, very, very good. It's a solid 2-drop. You can just play it on turn 2. The fact that you have all these spells in your deck means the prowess trigger is very relevant, but it also gives you this source of card advantage. You get to turn 4, turn 3, you can play Abbot. Maybe it's a land, there's a free land drop, maybe it's a spell that you can throw in. Just adds raw power to the red decks. And it is also one of the reasons that the red decks, they're not really the go wide red decks. These aren't dragon fodder, these aren't a bunch of 1/1 goblin tokens.
Right, no Hordling Outburst, not Goblin Rabble Masters particularly.
You know what else? Not Goblin Pile Driver.
No, that seems to have actively been just set aside.
It might actually be, you were saying, how do you not know about Exquisite Firecraft? Well, look, if you're testing red decks for this Pro Tour, you got to build a Goblin deck. The Goblin Pile Driver's back, and we've just been playing with Hordling Outburst and Dragon Fodder. Of course Goblin Pile Driver's going to be good, right?
Attacking for 9.
Nope, that is not the right way to build the red decks in this standard. So you almost had so many tools for these red decks that you had to figure out which ones do you actually want to use. How well can you predict the metagame? How well can you figure out which red deck is going to work? So it's not like, oh yeah, you just take Martin Deng's deck and throw in the cool new red toys. It's actually kind of a rebuild. It's almost a different, sub-archetype of red aggro decks.
One of the things I love about core sets is that reprints are not truly reprints. They still have the same words on them, but they behave very differently sometimes.
Yes.
Here's a card that is a reprint. It's from Born of the Gods. Let's talk about Searing Blood.
Yeah, I'm kind of cheating a little bit here. This isn't actually in Origins, but it's like a new card being added to the environment.
Right.
Because the metagame has changed so much, Searing Blood went from, maybe you sideboard it because it's good against the small creature decks. Jace means Searing Blood is now good against control decks.
Right.
That is the brilliant insight. If you saw Sam Black's interview at the end of yesterday, just articulated it perfectly. All of a sudden, Searing Blood's a main deck card. All of a sudden, this card, uncommon, it's been in from Born of the Gods, has become probably the best card in the red deck. It's good against the mirror, it's good against the green decks to kill Elvish Mystics. It kills Jace. It's almost like you got this newly printed card.
That's right. It's exactly the same words as it always has been, but suddenly the metagame shifts. Lots of cards suddenly have this different take on what they're achieving.
Yeah, it's like they just got a new toy to play with. And the people who figured that out are the people at the top of the Swiss.
Now, what is interesting, you've alluded to the fact that goblins didn't seem to be the way to go, and one of the things there is that goes very wide. One of the things that when you've got a ton of little creatures on the table you fear is mass removal, and one of the big spells that appeared to be a huge deal, certainly in Magic Origins, was Languish. Everything gets -4/-4.
Yeah, this card is definitely good. The red decks, they're not the go-wide red decks. They're more burn-heavy red decks because Languish exists, in part. Languish, though, still a good card. the Abzan decks are still here. The Abzan decks, they may not be number one. Siege Rhino is no longer the boss of Standard, but Siege Rhino still survives the Languish. You still put Siege Rhino and Tasigur in the same deck as Languish, and now your sweeper kills everything except your two best creatures. So Languish is around. It is adding a little bit of power level to those Abzan decks. They didn't get as much as the other decks, so they're no longer on top of Standard, but this is definitely an Origins card that you're going to see for the rest of the weekend.
I'm going to ask you about a comparison between a 2 black sorcery from Magic Origins and a 1 blue mana instant. And the 1 blue mana instant is called Force Spike. And my question for you is this. Historically, Force Spike is a card where once you have had your critical spell Force Spiked in game 1, you have to respect it in game 2 and 3, which meant you could always sideboard out your 1 Force Spike because it did the job by not being in the deck. Its existence was essentially sufficient. Having done it in once, you force the game to be played differently. Languish is a card that, on the face of it, if you're building this black-based control deck where everything must die, you want 3 or 4 copies of Languish. But interesting chatting to people, there seems to be sort of, well, I started with 4, then I thought maybe I'd make it 3, and then it ended up being 2 in the main and 1 in the board because actually its existence changes what everyone else is forced to do.
Yeah, in particular, it changed the way other people build their decks. In addition to changing the way they might sideboard, it has an impact on just the metagame of decks you're going to run into. Yeah, Languish is not the constructed superstar card. It's not the best card in the set by any stretch of the imagination. It may have been one of the more obvious ones when the set spoilers first started coming out. But yeah, it's a good, solid role player for the Abzan decks. It's not the superstar for exactly the reasons you'd explain.
Now here is a superstar, and it's a 0/0
Oh,
kind of.
Hangerback Walker is having an absolute breakout weekend. There are multiple teams of players that showed up basically playing an artifact deck. Blue-red, Hangerback Walker, it's almost the standard equivalent of an affinity deck somehow. You can play in solo artifact, you can play a bunch of, cheap artifacts, Whirler Rogues are showing up. Hangerback Walker's the superstar. This is the best card in that deck. This is the card that got people to start testing that deck. And you talk about the impact of Standard. You know what else Hangerback can do? It can block a creature with Intimidate. So if that Rally the Ancestors deck wants to, Mogis Marauder back, Nantuko Husk suddenly can only be blocked by black creatures and artifact creatures. So yet another thing. I think if you were on the edge about whether you wanted to play an artifacts deck or whether you wanted to play with Hangerback Walker, the fact that it's just naturally hoses the Rally the Ancestors deck is kind of nice.
Yeah, Jeff Hoodland, who came with blue-white control in the very first weekend of Standard with Hangerback Walker into Thopter Spy Network, he said, you know what, I think you are going to see this Standard being all about Hangerback Walker mirrors, that there are just going to be walkers on both sides of the table because they're so good for so many things, which has always been true of artifacts to an extent because they are colorless, they go where you want them to go. But this one does seem to do a lot of lifting for a lot of people.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, and we spent a lot of time yesterday talking about the red aggro decks, but I really do think the blue-red decks, those Ensoul Artifact decks with Hangerback Walker, may actually be the best decks of the weekend. In my mind, I can't tell yet which of those decks is going to be, the deck of the weekend. They're both in contention in my mind.
All right. We're going to close out this little segment on a really, really weird card. It's mythic. Of course it is. It's Demonic Pact.
Well, yeah, there are Demonic Pact decks here. We saw Antonio Del Moral Leon. He's already won a Pro Tour this season. He went 6-2 yesterday. I think he's 2-1 his draft as well, so he's still very much live for top 8. Demonic Pact is very powerful. If you can make sure you don't die to it, it's awesome.
Yes. I think you've said something quite important there, though, Randy.
It's not that important, by the way. You get 3 turns before you even have to worry about it. Sometimes the raw advantage, you're drawing cards, they're discarding, you're gaining some life. The thing is, though, you do have to have a way out of it. And so the way Antonio Del Moral Leon set his deck up, I just love it. He's got Woodland Bellowers, which is another great new Origins card. And the thing that he gets with his Woodland Bellowers more than anything else is invasive species. Return a permanent you control to your hand. It's like 3/3 for 3 mana, and it's kind of like, as a limited card, that was a drawback, right? You'd have to pick up a land. Well, pick up a Demonic Pact, and then recast it. It's awesome. Woodland Bellower for invasive species to pick up Demonic Pact has to be the coolest thing we saw yesterday.
That is filthy. That really is.
Just awesome deck.
Great stuff. All right. Well, how about some honourable mentions? Because there's plenty more cards
Definitely.
to go at. And some of these, well, we said mentions, but they're more like little chapters all of their own for some of them. Let's take a look.
There's the Woodland Bellower we just talked about. It's a lot of power. 6/5, go get another creature. Perfect for the Demonic Pact deck. I think it's enough raw power that people may do other things with it. The Whirler Rogue and the Chief of the Foundry are also showing up in that blue-red Insult Artifact deck as well. So these are very important Origins cards. I think at the end of the day, Origins has just had a significantly bigger impact than a lot of people expected. I mean, before the set came out, before we saw the spoiler, it was like, well, it's just a core set, quote unquote, just a core set.
You're always going to come up against that, aren't you?
It's also the biggest standard ever gets. It's an 8-set standard, right? R&D has decided to shrink standard, where it's only ever going to get to 6 sets in the future because it's so hard to have an impact with set number 8 when standard is this large. Guess what? They did it. Right. Origins is huge. You see, there's 3 more cards, and we've got another graphic with 3 more Origins cards that are having a big impact this weekend.
Yeah, let's have a look at Herald of the Pantheon, let's have a look at Sphinx's Tutelage, and let's have a look at Nantuko Husk.
Yeah, Nantuko Husk single-handedly put the Rally the Ancestors deck into this tournament. It is still relevant. I know Zvi Mashkovitz is piloting it. He's only got 2 losses this weekend, thanks in part to a 6-0 Unlimited. He's in great shape. So Nantuko Husk is very relevant. I mean, it looks innocuous, right? It's this limited card, a reprint, but that ability is very powerful. You can do some naughty things with it, and that's what the Rally the Ancestor deck specializes in. Herald the Pantheon, meanwhile, single-handedly putting Constellation decks back in the mix. You can play Abzan Constellation if you want your Doomwake Giants, or what we saw Kyle Bogomase do is to play Green-White Constellation, and he actually goes all the way up to the Sigil and just explodes Starfield of Nyx. You can do a lot of nice things, especially when your enchantments cost less. Third card, Sphinx's Tutelage. Andrew Cuneo. I mean, it's just Cuneo. I don't even know if anyone else is on this deck. I don't think anyone is. He's got a blue-red control deck. Well, we say control. He's got a blue-white mill deck. His deck is Sphinx's Tutelage and mill cards. And you go turn 2 Jace into turn 3 Sphinx's Tutelage, you can deck your opponent by turn 6. It is full of just draw a card, draw 2 cards. It's even got a Hammer's Archive in that deck to deck people twice as quickly with the Sphinx's Tutelage.
So nice.
Super fun.
Andrew Cuneo, I'm so glad you're on the Pro Tour. My hero. Now, day 1 metagame, we took a look at the front end of this, but we're into day 2 right now, and that tends to shift things around. Remember, everyone who didn't get a 4-4 record or better is gone. So we've crunched the numbers this morning. Why don't we take a look at what's coming our way in terms of the day 2 metagame breakdown. So here it is.
Yeah, this is actually still the same top 5. Devotion 1, Red Aggro 2, Abzan 3, Insult Artifact 4. But things have tightened. There used to be a big gap between Abzan Control and Insult Artifact. Insult Artifact is sort of climbing up the leaderboard. So now you've got 4 decks at over 10%. If you're prepared to beat these decks, you could have a very good afternoon coming up right here.
Worth mentioning the blue-red Insult Artifact. I'm doing this from memory, but I believe there were 33 yesterday.
That's the next graphic we've got for you.
Right.
28 for 33. That was the best deck yesterday.
Right, so why don't we take a look at how that converted. There we are, 28 of 33.
85% for the Insult. Now, some of that is that maybe those players drafted well, right? Day 2 conversion rate, it's 5 rounds of standard, 3 rounds of draft, so it's not a pure read on how good these decks are, but yeah, the red aggro story, I mean, it did fine. 65% is above par, but the Insult Artifact decks actually had the best rate at getting their players through to day 2. So, like I said, I don't know which of those decks we're going to walk away with as the story of the tournament, but they're both full of Origins cards and going to be factors in Standard moving forward from here.
Down at the bottom there, it said Ataka Red, only 5 of 15.
Yeah, that was...
As we always see, it's a world where you can't stand still. Standard is always moving. That, as we head towards the Standard rounds here at Pro Tour Magic Origins, was Inside Standard with Randy Buehler.